For centuries, people have known stoning as one of history's cruelest punishments. But very few realize what actually happened after the first stone was thrown. Eyewitness accounts from Afghanistan and medical evidence reveal a reality that was even darker than the sentence itself, one where death often refused to come quickly. Stoning is one of the oldest forms of execution known to humankind. References to it appear in some of the earliest legal and religious texts ever written, including parts of the Old Testament and ancient Mesopotamian law codes that were created thousands of years ago in the region often called the cradle of civilization. The reasoning behind the punishment was communal rather than individual. Instead of a single executioner carrying out the sentence, an entire crowd would throw stones together. Because many people took part, responsibility for the death was spread across the community. No single person was seen as solely responsible for the killing. By the 20th century, most countries and legal systems around the world had abandoned the practice entirely, replacing it with other forms of punishment. It survived only in a small number of countries that applied particularly strict interpretations of Sharia, the Islamic legal and moral system derived from religious teachings. Among those countries, Iran became the nation most closely associated with formally regulating and codifying stoning as a legal punishment. In 1980, just 1 year after the Iranian Revolution had transformed the country's political system, Iran's new penal code included detailed instructions explaining how a stoning execution was supposed to be carried out. One section of that code, known as Article 119, even specified the size of the stones that could be used. The law stated that the stones could not be so large that they would kill the condemned person immediately, but they also could not be so small that they would no longer be considered stones under the legal definition. That single detail reveals something important about the punishment. The death was never intended to be quick. The law itself was designed around prolonging the process. These regulations later became one of the most widely discussed examples of how stoning was formally structured under modern legal systems, influencing discussions about similar punishments elsewhere, including in Afghanistan decades later. The Taliban captured Afghanistan's capital city of Kabul on September 27, 1996, bringing an end to years of brutal civil war between rival Mujahideen factions that had been fighting for power after the Soviet-Afghan War. Once in control, the Taliban moved quickly to reshape the country's legal system. Within weeks, they replaced existing courts with religious courts overseen by qazis, judges who ruled according to their own interpretation of Sharia, rather than following a standardized national criminal code. Under this system, punishments could include amputations for theft, public floggings for various offenses, and execution for adultery. These punishments were often carried out as public spectacles rather than private legal proceedings. Kabul's sports stadium, originally built decades earlier to host athletic competitions and sporting events, was transformed into a venue for public punishments and executions. Residents were frequently ordered or pressured to attend. The purpose was not only to punish the accused individual, it was also to send a message to the wider population. By carrying out these punishments in front of large crowds, the Taliban demonstrated exactly what could happen to anyone accused of breaking the same laws. Under the Taliban's interpretation of Islamic law, adultery included any sexual relationship that took place outside of marriage. In practice, however, men and women accused of the same offense often faced very different outcomes. Women were far more likely to receive death sentences by stoning, while men frequently received lighter punishments, such as flogging or lashings. This imbalance became a recurring pattern and would appear repeatedly in documented cases over the following 2 decades. After the September 11th attacks in the United States in 2001, American and coalition forces launched military operations in Afghanistan. In December of that year, the Taliban government was removed from power. The religious courts that had operated openly under Taliban rule disappeared almost immediately from Kabul and most major cities. However, the Taliban themselves did not disappear. Many fighters and commanders retreated to rural regions and reorganized. In areas where they continued to hold influence, particularly in remote provinces far from government control. Unofficial Taliban courts continued functioning behind the scenes, operating alongside and often in direct opposition to the legal system of the new Afghan government. 9 years after the Taliban government had fallen, the first confirmed stoning execution in post-Taliban Afghanistan took place in Kunduz province, a region in northern Afghanistan. According to reports, a married man and an unmarried woman had begun a relationship and eventually ran away together from their families in the Dasht-e-Archi district. Taliban fighters later tracked them down and captured them. The pair were sentenced to death and stoned for adultery. Amnesty International later confirmed that this was the first documented stoning execution in Afghanistan since the Taliban had been removed from power in 2001. The organization's Asia-Pacific director, Sam Zarifi, publicly condemned the killings. He also warned that ongoing discussions about negotiating with the Taliban could potentially weaken the human rights protections that Afghanistan had spent nearly a decade trying to rebuild after the fall of the regime. The case highlighted a troubling reality. Even though the Taliban no longer controlled Afghanistan's national government, local Taliban commanders in certain districts still possessed enough power and influence to conduct their own trials, hand down death sentences, and carry out executions in front of local communities. In effect, a parallel justice system was operating within Afghanistan, enforcing its own rules and punishments despite the existence of an entirely separate official legal system recognized by the government. A video that surfaced the following year gave the outside world its clearest look yet at how one of these executions unfolded from beginning to end. The footage showed a stoning that had taken place in October 2011 in Afghanistan's Ghazni province. The victims were a man and a woman accused of having an affair. According to reports, some members of the local community objected to the execution and did not want it to take place. But their opposition did not stop the Taliban from carrying it out. Around 200 people gathered to watch the execution. Before it began, a Taliban mullah addressed the crowd and explained what he described as the religious justification for the punishment. The woman was then placed inside a hole about 4 feet deep. The pit was deep enough to prevent her from moving or trying to escape, but shallow enough that her head and shoulders remained above the ground, leaving them fully exposed. A group of men then began throwing rocks at her. Witnesses later described how the intensity of the attack increased as the execution continued. At one point, a large rock struck the woman directly in the head. The impact caused her to collapse. Eventually, the stone throwing stopped. Several people in the crowd began discussing whether she had already died. She had not. She was still alive. The execution was finally brought to an end when one of the spectators stepped forward and fired 3 shots from an AK-47 rifle, killing her. The man was brought forward separately. He was blindfolded using his own clothing before his execution was carried out. The footage, which was later obtained and broadcast by ABC News, became one of the earliest pieces of clear visual evidence showing an important reality about stoning. The stones alone did not reliably kill within a fixed or predictable amount of time. In this case, it ultimately took gunfire to finish what the stones had failed to do. Now, understanding the physical effects also answers the central question of how long a person can remain alive during a stoning. In 1993, a researcher named Harold Hillman published a scientific study in the academic journal Perception. His research compared the physical effects of pain and death across nearly every major method of execution used around the world at that time, including shooting, hanging, stoning, beheading, electrocution, gas chambers, and lethal injection. To reach his conclusions, Hillman examined evidence from post-mortem examinations, animal studies, and medical comparisons with severe trauma cases treated by emergency doctors. His conclusion was straightforward. According to Hillman, stoning produced the slowest death of any execution method included in his research. When a person is buried up to the neck and confined inside a pit, they are unable to move freely or raise their arms to protect themselves. As a result, their head becomes the main vulnerable target exposed to the stones being thrown. Death usually occurs because repeated blows cause severe injuries to the skull and brain, leading to massive bleeding both inside and outside the head. Doctors often compare these injuries to the kind of brain trauma seen in victims of major car accidents. The difference is that a serious car crash usually delivers one extremely powerful impact all at once. Stoning, on the other hand, delivers dozens of smaller impacts over time. Each strike adds more damage than the last, until the cumulative injuries to the brain eventually become fatal. This was not simply an unintended consequence of the punishment. It was built directly into the legal rules governing how stoning was supposed to be carried out in places such as Iran. As mentioned earlier, the penal code specifically stated that the stones could not be large enough to kill the victim in just 1 or 2 blows. In other words, the law itself required the execution to unfold gradually, instead of ending quickly. Hillman's research also highlighted another important observation. People being stoned are often heard shouting, crying out, and screaming throughout much of the process. From a medical perspective, that is significant because it indicates that they remain conscious and capable of feeling pain long after the first rocks strike their body. Using medical data from survivors of severe head injuries, together with documented eyewitness accounts, such as the execution in Ghazni province, experts estimate that a person may remain alive for several minutes at the very least. In some cases, survival can last considerably longer if the early stones strike the arms, chest, or other parts of the body, instead of causing immediate severe injuries to the head. By comparison, Hillman's research found that a gunshot to the head can cause unconsciousness in a fraction of a second, while a properly performed judicial hanging can result in the loss of sensation within seconds. By every available medical comparison, stoning was deliberately structured to be different. 4 years after the Ghazni execution footage became public, another highly publicized stoning case emerged, this time from Ghor province in central Afghanistan. Although the internationally backed Afghan government was still officially in power, large parts of Ghor remained under significant Taliban influence, allowing the group to continue operating its own unofficial courts and enforcing its own punishments. The victim was a 19-year-old woman named Rokhshana. She was accused of having a premarital relationship with a 23-year-old man named Mohammed Gul. According to Muhammad Zaman Azimi, a local government official who later spoke to reporters, a Taliban court sentenced Rokhshana to death by stoning. Mohammed Gul, who had been accused of the same relationship, received a far lighter punishment. Instead of being sentenced to death, he was ordered to receive a public lashing. Eyewitness video later showed the execution taking place. The footage captured a group of men throwing stones with increasing force at a person confined inside a hole in the ground. Around them, onlookers watched while several people recorded the execution on their mobile phones. Throughout much of the video, Rokhshana's cries and screams could be heard, making the footage one of the clearest modern records of how such punishments were carried out. The killing was widely condemned by governments, human rights organizations, and international observers around the world. It also reinforced a pattern that had remained remarkably consistent since the Taliban's first period in power during the 1990s. In cases involving accusations of adultery or other sexual relationships outside marriage, women repeatedly received much harsher punishments than men accused of the very same conduct. Over the following decade, the pattern showed little sign of changing. On August 15, 2021, Kabul fell to the Taliban as American and NATO forces completed their withdrawal from Afghanistan after nearly 20 years of war. Within just a few weeks of taking control of the country, the Taliban began rebuilding the same religious court system it had operated during its first rule in the 1990s. This time, however, there was no rival Afghan government left to challenge its authority anywhere in the country. Violence returned almost immediately, but not through formal court proceedings. Human Rights Watch documented 47 cases of summary executions and enforced disappearances involving former members of the Afghan National Security Forces between August 15th and October 31st, 2021. A summary execution is the killing of a person without a fair trial or any legal process. These cases were concentrated in the provinces of Ghazni, Helmand, Kandahar, and Kunduz, although similar incidents were also reported in Khost, Bakhtia, and Paktika. These early killings were not stonings. Instead, they involved former soldiers, police officers, and intelligence personnel who had already surrendered but were executed anyway. Even so, the incidents revealed an important pattern. Within only a few months of returning to power, the Taliban had once again begun governing through fear and public intimidation, relying on the same methods that had helped maintain control during its first regime, roughly 25 years earlier. On December 7, 2022, the Taliban carried out the first officially confirmed public execution since returning to power. The man who was executed had been convicted of fatally stabbing another man in 2017, several years before the Taliban regained control of Afghanistan. He was not stoned. Instead, he was shot. One unusual aspect of the execution was who carried it out. Rather than being executed by Taliban officials themselves, the fatal shots were fired by the father of the murder victim. This followed the Taliban's interpretation of qisas, a form of retributive justice under Islamic law in which, under certain circumstances, the victim's family has the right to carry out or approve the punishment. The event attracted attention not only because of the execution itself, but because of the senior Taliban leaders who attended it. Taliban spokesperson Zabihullah Mujahid announced that more than a dozen top officials were present. Among them were Acting Interior Minister Sirajuddin Haqqani, Acting Deputy Prime Minister Abdul Ghani Baradar, the country's Chief Justice, and the Acting Foreign and Education Ministers. This wasn't a quiet execution carried out by local commanders in an isolated village. It was treated as an official state event. According to the Taliban, the death sentence had been reviewed by 3 separate courts before receiving final approval from the group's supreme spiritual leader, Khaibatullah Akhundzada, who operates from Kandahar. Reports also indicated that earlier that same month, Akhundzada had met with judges and instructed them to issue rulings based on a strict interpretation of Sharia law. In the weeks leading up to the execution, public floggings for offenses such as robbery and adultery had also resumed in several provinces, despite a statement from the United Nations Human Rights Office calling on the Taliban to end such punishments. During the following 2 years, the Taliban's Supreme Court began publishing statistics about its judicial activity. Many observers believed these reports were intended to demonstrate the group's commitment to enforcing its version of religious law throughout Afghanistan. According to the Taliban's own figures, between the 2021 takeover and roughly 3 years afterward, the Supreme Court issued more than 176 death sentences and 37 stoning sentences. During that same period, 587 people, including 106 women, were subjected to corporal punishment carried out in public. Looking at the numbers year by year, more than 295 people were publicly flogged between March 2022 and March 2023. That figure then dropped sharply to 44 during the following year, before rising again to more than 240 in the year after that. Human Rights Watch separately confirmed several executions, along with at least 1 additional stoning that had been approved by Taliban courts and local officials after the group returned to power. These cases were separate from the much larger number of extrajudicial killings targeting former Afghan security personnel, which researchers estimated numbered in the hundreds. Afghan citizens, journalists, and human rights organizations have repeatedly argued that the real number of executions and stonings is probably much higher than the Taliban officially reports, since many of these punishments take place in remote rural districts where independent observers have little or no access. In May 2023, the United Nations formally urged the Taliban to stop all state executions after releasing a report documenting public executions, stonings, floggings, forced head shaving, and other forms of physical punishment being carried out across Afghanistan. By the middle of 2023, at least 5 public executions had been carried out since the Taliban returned to power in 2021. These took places in the provinces of Ghazni, Farah, Laghman, and Sar-e-Pul. The continued use of stoning in Afghanistan is closely tied to the way the Taliban's legal system operates. Unlike many modern legal systems, it's not based on a fixed criminal code that lawmakers can easily amend or repeal. Instead, its rulings are based on religious scholars interpreting centuries-old religious texts. Under the leadership of Khaibatullah Akhundzada, the Taliban has consistently placed the strict enforcement of its interpretation of Sharia law above international criticism, diplomatic pressure, or the country's economic isolation. There is also another important factor, especially outside Afghanistan's largest cities. For decades, successive Afghan governments, including the monarchy, the later republic, and the internationally backed government that ruled after 2001, struggled to establish full authority over many remote rural provinces. In those areas, local religious courts often filled the gap long before the Taliban emerged in their current form. Many villagers viewed these courts as easier to access than distant government courts, which were frequently criticized for corruption, delays, and inefficiency. That reality did not suddenly disappear when the Taliban returned to power in August 2021. It was the same situation that allowed Taliban-run courts to continue operating in places like Kunduz in 2010, Ghazni in 2011, and Ghor in 2015, years before the Taliban once again took control of the presidential palace in Kabul.